6:42 in the morning. The surgical cap was still in his hand when they told him he couldn't go in. Idris Saleh had been awake since 4. Not because of anxiety. He had done this procedure more than 300 times. He was awake because that was simply how he was built. Early riser, quiet house. 2 cups of coffee before the sun came up. Then the drive along the 401 into Toronto. The city still gray and half asleep outside his window. He had parked in the attending physician's lot, badged through the main entrance, taken the elevator to the 7th floor, the way he had done every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the last 11 years. The OR, scheduled for that morning, was a triple bypass. The patient, a 58-year-old man named Gordon Fitch, had been admitted 2 days prior after a Widowmaker event that left 40% of his cardiac muscle starving for blood. The surgical team had reviewed the file together the evening before. Everything was in order. Idris had spoken directly with the anesthesiologist, confirmed instrument preferences with the scrub nurse, called Gordon's wife at 9 p.m. to walk her through what the morning would look like. He was, by every measure, exactly where he was supposed to be. The man who stopped him was standing beside the nursing station just outside the OR corridor. His name tag read B. Harlow, Hospitastic. He was heavy-set, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the posture of someone who had spent years learning that a certain kind of stillness communicated authority. He put a hand up when he saw Idris approaching. "Sir, this is a restricted area." Idris slowed but didn't stop. "I'm aware. I'm the attending cardiac surgeon. I have a case starting in 18 minutes. Harlow stepped sideways, positioning himself more squarely in the corridor. "I'm going to need you to show me some ID." This was not unusual. Idris kept his hospital badge, clipped to the breast pocket of his white coat, the same place it had lived for over a decade. He held it up without breaking stride. Harlow looked at it. Then he looked at Idris. Then he looked at the badge again, with the particular slowness of a man who had already decided what he was looking for and was searching for a reason to justify the conclusion he'd already reached. "Where are you actually headed?" Idris stopped. He turned and looked at the man directly. "OR 7, triple bypass. Patient is prepped and waiting." "You're a surgeon." It wasn't a question. But it wasn't an acknowledgement either. It landed somewhere between the two, a statement made to fill air, while a decision was being reconsidered. "Cardiac surgeon," Idris said. 11 years at this hospital. Dr. Idris Saleh. He said his own name the way someone might say it to a wall. Steady, clear, without anger. Because anger, he had learned long ago, was a luxury he could not afford in moments like this one. Anger would become the story. Anger would become the reason. Harlow took out a small notepad. "I'm going to need you to wait here while I verify that. My patient is on the table." "It won't take long." "He is on the table," Idris said again, more slowly this time. "Do you understand what that means? His chest is open. Every minute you delay." "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." His voice had not been raised. 3 nurses were watching from the station. A resident was standing near the water fountain 10 meters away, pretending to check his phone. No one said anything. Nobody moved. Idris looked at his watch. 6:44. He looked at Harlow. "Call Dr. Christine Adler. She's the chief of surgery. Her extension is 4471. She will confirm who I am in under 30 seconds. Harlow wrote something in his notepad. "I'm going to call the administrative desk. Call Christine Adler." "Sir, our protocol." "Your protocol," Idris said. And for the first time there was something in his voice that was not calm. Not anger, exactly, but the edge of a man who was calculating exactly how much composure he had left and spending it carefully is going to cost that man his life. Harlow called the administrative desks. The administrative desk transferred him to a general nursing line. The general nursing line put him on hold. The hold music was a soft instrumental version of something Idris couldn't place and did not care to. 4 minutes passed. In OR 7, Gordon Fitch's heart was being sustained by a bypass pump. His wife, Helen, was sitting in a waiting room on the 4th floor with a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Their daughter had driven up from Hamilton the night before and was sitting beside her, holding her hand. They were waiting for Idris. Idris was standing in a corridor, watching a security guard hold a phone to his ear and periodically nod at nothing. At 6:51, Dr. Christine Adler came through the double doors at the far end of the hallway. She was in surgical scrubs, her mask pulled down around her chin, and she was walking with the very specific energy of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something important and had made a decision about how she was going to handle the next 30 seconds. She looked at Harlow. She looked at Idris. She looked at the notepad in Harlow's hand. "What is happening here?" "Ma'am, I was following protocol." "This is Dr. Idris Saleh," Christine said. "He is the head of our cardiac surgery division. He has been on staff at this hospital since 2013. He has privileges in every OR on this floor." She paused. "Is there something else you need from him?" Harlow looked at his notepad. "I was asked to verify." "By whom?" A silence. "By whom?" she asked again. Harlow did not answer. Christine turned to Idris. "I'm sorry. Go." Idris went. He scrubbed in at 6:54. The procedure began at 7:03. Gordon Fitch's triple bypass took 4 hours and 11 minutes. And when it was done, when the bypass was removed and the heart was beating on its own again, strong and steady, the kind of rhythm that makes surgeons exhale for the first time in hours, Idris stood at the scrub sink and held his hands under the water for a long moment and said nothing. He had been doing this long enough to know that the anger came later. In the moment, during the work, there was no room for it. But afterward, in the quiet, it arrived. He thought about the 4 minutes. He thought about what 4 minutes meant in cardiac surgery. He thought about the notepad and the hold music and the 3 nurses who had watched and said nothing. He dried his hands. He went to speak with Helen Fitch. What no one outside the 7th floor knew, at least not yet, was that this was not the first time. Bernard Harlow had been with hospital security for 16 years. His record was not clean. There had been a complaint filed in 2019 by an attending physician, a woman named Dr. Yemi Osei from the hematology department, who reported that Harlow had stopped her at the entrance to the oncology ward and demanded to see her credentials 3 times in a single shift, cased, despite the fact that her badge was clearly visible and her face was well known to every nurse on the floor. That complaint had been reviewed. Harlow had been spoken to. He had received what the HR summary described as corrective coaching. He had not been suspended. He had not been moved to a different department. He had been spoken to, and then things had continued. There had been a second complaint in 2021 from a resident in the emergency department who described being followed through a hallway and questioned about his purpose on the floor while he was actively responding to a code blue. That complaint had been logged. There was no record of any follow-up action. Idris did not know about these complaints when he walked into Christine's office at 11 o'clock that morning. He found out because Christine told him. She had pulled the file herself in the 2 hours between the corridor incident and his arrival at her door. And what she found had made her sit very still at her desk for a long time before she picked up the phone to call the hospital administrator. "I want you to hear this from me directly," she said, "because you deserve to. He has done this before. Not to you specifically, but this is a pattern. and it was not addressed. Idris sat across from her. He was still in his scrubs. He hadn't eaten since the coffee at 4 in the morning. Is Gordon stable? He's in recovery. Strong vitals. His wife is with him. He nodded. Good. Christine was quiet for a moment. I need you to write a formal statement. What happened this morning? In your own words. With times. Everything. I know. And I want you to know, she said, that this is going to go further than HR. Idris looked at her. How much further? I've already spoken with administration. They're bringing in an external review board. This isn't going to be handled quietly. He studied her face to see if she meant it. He had been in rooms like this one before. Rooms where the right things were said, with the right tone and the right expression, and then nothing changed. He had learned to listen not just to words, but to the spaces around them, the small hesitations that told you more than the words themselves. There were no hesitations. All right, he said. The statement took 2 hours to write. Idris wrote it at a desk, in a small office. Christine had cleared for him, with a cup of tea that went cold, and a window that looked out over the hospital parking lot, where his car sat in the attending physician's lot, right where he'd left it. He wrote everything. The time he arrived. The way Harlow had positioned himself. The exact words. He had a good memory, the kind of memory that surgeons develop when they spend years dictating operative notes, when every word has to be precise because someone's record depends on it. He wrote about the 3 nurses who had watched. He wrote about the resident near the water fountain. He wrote about the hold music. He wrote, at no point did any staff member in the corridor intervene or offer assistance. He read it back once, made 2 small corrections, and sent it to Christine. Then he sat for a moment and thought about something his father had told him when he was 12 years old, back in Khartoum, before the family had moved north and then west, and eventually to a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, where Idris had spent his teenage years doing homework at the kitchen table, while his father worked nights at a distribution warehouse, and his mother studied English from library books. His father had said, "You will have to be twice as good. That is not fair. It is also true. So be twice as good, and then be patient, because eventually the truth shows itself." Idris had been twice as good. He had been twice as good for 37 years. He was still working on the patient part. The external review took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Idris continued to operate. He did not request a leave of absence. He did not speak to the press. 2 journalists had reached out through the hospital communications office, and he had declined both. He went to work. He did the work. He drove the 401 in the early morning, parked in the attending lot, took the elevator to 7, and did what he had done for 11 years. He was aware of being watched differently. Not by everyone. Most of his colleagues were unchanged, or made a point of being noticeably unchanged, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. But in hallways, in the cafeteria, in the elevator, there were glances. The particular glances of people trying to figure out how this was going to land before they decided where to stand. He had seen those glances before, too. The review board was composed of 3 people. An external HR specialist from a firm that handled institutional misconduct cases, a patient safety officer from a different Ontario hospital, and a retired judge named Sylvia Moorcraft, who had spent 12 years on the Ontario Superior Court before moving into arbitration. They interviewed 14 people. Harlow's supervisor, the nurses who had been at the station that morning, the resident by the water fountain, whose name was Dr. Aiden Park, and who, to his credit, gave a statement that was detailed, accurate, and did not minimize what he had witnessed. They pulled every complaint on file for Bernard Harlow dating back to 2017. They found 5. 2 had been formally documented. 3 had been, in the board's eventual language, informally noted and not pursued. They also interviewed Harlow himself. In that interview, Harlow said he had been following protocol. He said the corridor was a restricted area. He said he had not been aware of Dr. Saleh's identity at the time of the incident. When asked why he had not accepted the badge as sufficient identification, as the hospital's own protocol stated it should be, Harlow said that the badge could have belonged to anyone. The board member who asked the follow-up question was Sylvia Moorcraft. She asked, "When Dr. Saleh specifically asked you to call Dr. Adler, the chief of surgery, rather than the administrative desk, why did you decline to do that?" Harlow said he was following protocol. Moorcraft wrote something on her notepad. She did not ask another question on that topic. The board's findings were released on a Thursday morning in late November. The language was formal, the way such documents always are, but the meaning was not difficult to extract. Bernard Harlow had acted outside the bounds of established hospital security protocol on the morning in question. His actions had caused a documented delay to a time-sensitive surgical procedure. The delay, while the surgery ultimately proceeded without complication, represented a serious failure in patient safety. The board further found that the hospital's handling of previous complaints against Harlow, specifically the failure to take corrective action after repeated documented incidents, constituted an institutional failure. Harlow's employment was terminated effective immediately. The hospital issued a formal apology to Dr. Saleh. It also announced the creation of a new review process for security protocol to be developed in consultation with clinical staff, specifically designed to ensure that medical personnel in active patient care situations could not occur. The administrator released a statement. Christine released a statement. There was a brief item in the Toronto Star, buried in the city section, which described the situation in 3 paragraphs. Idris did not release a statement. He had been asked if he wanted to. He had said no. What he did was go back to work. He was in OR 7 the following Tuesday morning. New patient, a 63-year-old woman named Frances, referred from Sunnybrook, with a valve replacement that had been scheduled for 3 months. The procedure was textbook, clean. The kind of case where everything goes the way it's supposed to go and you finish, and you feel the particular satisfaction of a thing done exactly right. He drove home in the early afternoon, the city moving past his windows in that pale November light that makes Toronto look like a photograph of itself. He called his mother from the car. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her neighbor's new dog, a show she was watching, whether he was eating properly. He was eating properly. He told her so. She did not believe him. So, 3 months later, Idris was asked to speak at a patient safety conference held at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine. He almost declined. He said yes, eventually, because Christine asked him personally, and because he had come to believe that there was a difference between privacy and silence, and that he had held on to one long enough that he had started confusing it with the other. He stood at a podium in a room full of physicians and hospital administrators and medical students, and he told the story. Not the version with the board's language and the formal findings. The actual version. The hold music. The notepad. The 3 nurses who didn't say anything. He said, "I want to be precise about something. I was not afraid for myself that morning. I have been in this building for 11 years. My credentials are not in question." He paused. "I was afraid for Gordon Fitch. I was afraid because I was 4 minutes away from a man whose heart was open, and I was standing in a corridor, and nobody moved. The room was quiet. The question I want to leave with you is not about Bernard Harlow. He is one person. The question is about the corridor. about the people who watched, about the systems that allowed him to do, 5 separate times, what he did to me, and responded each time with a conversation and a note in a file. He looked out at the room, medical students in the back rows, administrators near the front, people who would go on to build policies, to write protocols, to decide what happened when someone filed a complaint. Accountability is not what happens to one person at the end. Accountability is what happens the first time, and the second time, and the third time. What happened to me was not an accident. It was the conclusion of a process that had been running for years. He looked down at his notes, then back up. I'd ask you to think about what processes are running in your institutions right now, quietly, that you haven't looked at in a while. He stepped back from the podium. The room was still quiet for a moment before it began to applaud. Gordon Fitch was discharged 11 days after his surgery. His wife Helen sent a card to the hospital addressed to the cardiac surgery team. She had written inside it in careful cursive, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a particular generation. Thank you for giving me more time with him. The card ended up on the bulletin board outside the nurse's station on the 7th floor, held up with a blue pushpin. Idris saw it there weeks later on a Tuesday morning. He read it once. He straightened it slightly on the board so it sat level. Then he went to scrub in. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to read their stripes. Idris Saleh simply kept working and let the record speak for itself. I keep thinking about that corridor, not the outcome, the corridor itself. The 4 minutes, the hold music, the 3 people who stood there and watched and decided, in that moment, that it wasn't their place to say anything. I've been in rooms like that. I think most of us have. Moments where something wrong is happening right in front of you, and you do the math in your head. The cost of speaking up versus the cost of staying quiet. And you choose quiet because quiet feels safer. I'm not throwing stones. I've made that calculation myself more times than I'd like to admit. But watching what happened to Idris Saleh, I couldn't help thinking about what that silence actually costs. Not in the abstract. In minutes. In a man's heart, open on a table, waiting. What struck me most about Idris wasn't his credentials, though they were undeniable. It wasn't even his composure, though that was remarkable. It was the fact that he had been preparing for that moment his whole life without knowing it. His father told him when he was 12, "Be twice as good and be patient." That's not a philosophy you arrive at easily. That's something you build, slowly, out of years of moments where you had every right to be angry and chose precision instead. That's character. That's the kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up consistently at 6:44 in the morning when someone puts a hand up and tells you to wait. What happened to him also wasn't random. Bernard Harlow had done this before, 5 times, and each time the institution had looked at the complaint, written something down, and moved on. That's the part that stays with me. Because the real failure wasn't one man with a notepad. It was the accumulation of small decisions by people in positions of responsibility who told themselves the problem wasn't serious enough to act on. Every one of those quiet decisions was its own choice, and every one of them made the next incident more likely. There's a version of this story where Idris doesn't say anything, where he absorbs it, the way people absorb things they've absorbed 100 times before, and files it away somewhere private and keeps going. A lot of people do that. I understand why. It's exhausting to be the person who keeps raising their hand. It costs something. But Idris wrote the statement. He spoke at the conference. He stood at a podium and said, clearly and without dramatics, that the problem wasn't one bad actor. It was the corridor. It was everyone in it. That took a different kind of courage than surgical skill. It took the willingness to be seen, to use the authority he'd earned not just in an operating room, but in a room full of people who needed to hear it. I think about Gordon Fitch's wife, her careful cursive on that card. Thank you for giving me more time with him. She was thanking a surgical team. She didn't know about the corridor, or the 4 minutes, or what it took to get there that morning. But we do. And maybe that's the point. The work that holds things together is often the work that nobody sees. The question is whether we're paying attention, and whether, when it matters, we're willing to move.